So I first just want to thank Takezawa-san and the staff of the Institute for Research on the Humanities for allowing me to participate in this very exciting symposium that is on a subject very close to my own the research for many years, so it's really a pleasure to be here. In 1966, at the height of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, George DeVos and Hiroshi Wagatsuma published Japan's Invisible Race, Caste in Culture and Personality, in which they argued for the congruence between race, formerly understood by anthropologists as a real scientific category describing human physical differences, and caste, understood as an artificial division based on a pseudo-historical religious mythology. They suggested that untouchables in Asia faced similar prejudiced attitudes and societal discrimination as what they called the American Negro. Yet their comparison assumed that the American Negro typified a category of visible race to which invisible race could be only imperfectly analogized. Indeed, we're accustomed to thinking of the U.S. South as the epicenter of visible race, in which a stark line between black and white created a binary racial order that could not be disrupted, one immediately apparent to all who observed it. This black-white binary is often explained by the prevalence of a one drop of blood rule, in which any trace of African ancestry made a person black, one that still dominates cultural understandings of racial identity in the United States today. Yet over the course of U.S. history, the one-drop rule did not dominate the legal regime of race. In the courtroom, despite a variety of degree of blood rules in statutes, neighbors, lawyers, and experts came together to determine racial identity less often by documents of ancestry or even by outward appearance than by reading invisible signs of blood in a person's demeanor, character, or performance of identity, or in the hidden signs of the body. Even in the 19th century South, race was not always marked by the visible. Invisible race held a powerful sway on the Southern imagination, as well as the legal structures undergirding slavery. Today, I want to talk to you about the way invisible race operated in trials of racial identity, cases where courts had to decide for a variety of reasons whether someone was black, white, or Indian, and which took place in courtrooms across the United States and across U.S. history. They took place when a slave sued for freedom, claiming to be white, when someone was accused of a crime that was particular to persons of color, or after the end of slavery, when a person was kept out of school or prevented from becoming a citizen because he was not white. So first, I'll talk about two examples of racial identity trials. Then I'm going to talk about what I call the invisible common sense of race in American law. And here I'm using common sense in a slightly different way than our previous speaker, not about the common sense of scholars, but about the common sense of ordinary people in the courtroom. And I'm going to end by talking, if I have time, about the new invisible race in U.S. courtrooms, DNA. My examples. In 1857, Alexina Morrison, a slave in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, ran away from her master and surrendered herself to the parish jail for protection. She told her jailer, William Dennison, that she was white and had been kidnapped into slavery in Arkansas. Dennison believed Alexina, who had, according to him, blue eyes and flaxen hair. He took her home with him to the town of New Carrollton and introduced her into white society, taking her to balls and other amusements with his family. With the help of Dennison and other white citizens, she sued her master, John White, for her freedom in the local court. She had won over the white people of the town to such a degree that when James White came to file his answer at the courthouse, he was, quote, surrounded and threatened by a lawless mob who wanted to lynch him for keeping Alexina a slave. Her case went through 3 trials in Jefferson Parish Court. At the first trial, Alexina's lawyers asked the jurors to trust the evidence of their senses, to look at her themselves, and to believe the testimony of neighbors like them. Her witnesses assured the jury she had fit in perfectly at their balls. She had slept in their beds with their daughters, and they surely would have known if she had a drop of African blood. White's lawyers, instead, tried to show that race was something one could not discover through appearances, something that required expertise to discern. His witnesses used the language of science to declare Alexina Morrison colored, and White introduced documents to prove that she and her mother had been slaves in the Morrison family in Arkansas and Texas. The trial ended in a hung jury, meaning the jury could not agree. After the mob attack on him, White was able to have the trial moved, claiming that the citizens of the town were biased against him. At the second trial, Alexina brought more white witnesses who swore that she was white, making the argument that a true Louisiana native, quote, could always detect in a person whether that person is of African origin, as the alligator knows 3 days in advance that a storm is brewing. Several doctors testified on her behalf that the shape of her hair follicles and the arches of her feet proved that she was white. James White, by contrast, tried to show her Negro blood by calling her sexual virtue into question, accusing her jailer of fathering her child, and questioning her witnesses about her behavior at public balls. Yet the second jury found in Alexina Morrison's favor. White won a new trial in the Louisiana Supreme Court, but the third trial in January 1862 ended in another hung jury, 10 votes for Alexina Morrison and 2 against. Although White appealed again, the Supreme Court shut its doors in February of that year as the Union Army occupied New Orleans. So we don't know what happened to Alexina Morrison, although almost certainly, one way or the other, she found her freedom in 1862 or 1863. Alexina Morrison was undoubtedly a slave, almost certainly had some African ancestry, but repeatedly won over white jurors who believed she should have her freedom. Her racial identity should have been obvious to everyone, certainly to Southerners who insisted they knew race as alligators knew when a storm was coming. But race was not obvious, nor did legal rules about Negro identity, which were formulated in terms of ancestry, such as one grandfather or one great-grandfather in African, decide the question. More persuasive to the witnesses and jurors at trial were stories about the hidden marks of race, as interpreted by the doctors and neighbors, and stories about Alexina's behavior, her dancing, her mingling with white families, her love affairs with white men. While racial identity might inhere in her blood, blood made itself known through the ways she performed her identity. She may have had a Negro grandfather, she certainly had an enslaved mother, but she exhibited whiteness in a way that convinced the neighbors and the jurors that she was white. Now, in trials involving a man's racial identity, there was often a kind of circularity to the courtroom inquiry. To gain full rights of citizenship, a man had to be proven white. To be proven white, he had to demonstrate that he had acted like a citizen. So the example I want to tell you just quickly was a case called Bryan versus Walton. It went up and down the Georgia court system 3 times in the 1840s and 50s. And the question was whether Joseph Nunez and his father were white and could convey slaves, could sell or transfer slaves. The witnesses could not agree on whether Joseph had straight hair or curly hair, dark skin or light skin, appeared Indian or appeared Negro. Witnesses on one side testified that he appeared Indian, that his actions and movements were genteel and his dancing graceful, that he associated with respectable whites and dined with whites the same as any gentleman. On the other side, witnesses testified that the Nunezes were known as free-colored persons, did not vote or perform military service, and were not received and treated as white men. Only one witness suggested that Joseph Nunez had voted and performed military service, while half a dozen others said that they had not. And this evidence appears to have made the difference. The jury determined that Joseph Nunez was not white. Despite the community's disagreement over the Nunez's identity, they did agree on one thing: their race could be known through their performances. Race was not only something they were, but something they did. Who was a white man? A civic being who voted, served on juries, mustered in the militia. Contemporary participants in the racial system did not view those arguments as circular. Rather, they saw them as self-evident and self-reinforcing. In part, testimony about civic acts was a kind of reputation evidence. If a man had voted, it meant other branches of government had recognized him as white before. But courts also gave a different kind of explanation. As one judge explained, when race was not visible, when a person had an ambiguous appearance, evidence of social acceptance and the exercise of rights could trump ancestry. This judge wrote, "It may be well and proper that a man of worth, honesty, industry, and respectability should have the rank of a white man, while a vagabond of the same degree of blood should be confined to the inferior caste. It is hardly necessary to say that a slave cannot be a white man. A slave cannot be a white man. What made someone white or black was not necessarily visible appearance, but the invisible degradation or honor that accompanied status or rank." In Morrison's and Nunez's cases, as in many other trials from the 19th century South, invisible race was at least as important as visible race, even in a society where legal institutions and slaveholders were trying to draw a sharp, visible color line. Whether a man voted, sat on a jury, mustered in the militia, whether a woman exhibited sexual purity, whom they associated with, how they danced, all of these performances constituted their identity as much as color. Doctors also read invisible signs on feet and hair follicles to determine hidden race. Through these invisible signs, communities and courts decided who had the rank of a white man and who should be confined to the inferior caste. I'm going to skip over this and say something about common sense. So I mentioned that the important testimony in these cases was both the testimony of experts and the testimony of ordinary people, neighbors, who talked about reputation and performances. And in my opinion, that testimony that from neighbors expressed what I call racial common sense. And that racial common sense had both visible and invisible aspects. It was common sense Southerners fell back on when their eyesight failed them, when racially ambiguous people of mixed ancestry confounded their expectations of color or physiognomy. Mark Smith, who's written about race and the senses, emphasized that Southerners relied on all of their senses, especially hearing and smell, to imagine racial difference beyond the visible. But I found, as I gave in these two examples, that even with total disagreement among neighbors about visible appearances, they went beyond even smell and hearing to something even more ineffable. And that is what the witnesses were describing when they explained this instinct that natives of the South had. In the courtroom, there was a constant back and forth between that kind of community knowledge or common sense and the racial expertise of doctors. So this is a period, the beginning in the antebellum period, when doctors were presenting themselves as experts to court and trying to claim a monopoly on scientific racial knowledge. And of course, today we still have scientists presenting themselves as particular experts in this type of knowledge. But trials always returned to common sense and community understandings, and often did so by casting ordinary people as racial experts. So this would happen by judges questioning witnesses and asking white witnesses, did they own slaves themselves? Had they spent time among people of the African race? Did they know the distinctions between the African and Caucasian race? And so through that kind of conferring of expertise onto ordinary lay people through mastery, if you were a master of slaves, you could be an expert on race. They also encouraged lay people to put their testimony in more scientific terms. So lay witnesses described the characteristic difference between the white race and the black. And in Alexina Morrison's case, not only did doctors examine her feet, but so did a merchant seaman who explained that sailors had a lot of expertise on these racial differences as well. Locating expertise in the community is not necessarily a good thing. Neighbors wielded their racial knowledge as a weapon against enemies. Danger and violence often resulted from community action. So in one Tennessee case, for example, a neighbor determined to settle the question of one family's ambiguous racial identity told other members of the community that he planned what he called a speaking to see if the Perkins had souls or no, and if it was appertained that they had no souls, he would take his gun and go down and kill them. According to this account, he believed these mulattoes, when mixed that far, had no souls. The status of this family, who had lived as white and sent their children to white schools for many years, appeared to depend on whether they made someone angry. As their lawyer summed up in his notes to the case, when people mad, called them Negroes. Not mad, dark-skinned. That case reminds us of the power of local law and local culture in creating the ideas and norms that shape our lives. Race was not something imposed from above, imagined by experts and acquiesced in by ordinary people. It was created and recreated every day through the workings of community institutions and individuals in daily life. So the last couple of cases I want to mention are cases from the 20th century about naturalization to citizenship. So in the early 20th century, the new science of cultural anthropology challenged 19th century phrenology and physical anthropology. Cultural anthropologists argued that differences among groups of people before designated as races could best be explained by culture rather than biology. These scientific experts in the courtroom, professors rather than local doctors, began to offer a variety of cultural explanations, at times arguing race was a cultural category that was biologically indeterminable, at other times that racial differences were merely physical, with no cultural significance. While litigants continued to turn to science for answers about who is white, when science offered contradictory or counterintuitive answers, courts always returned to racial common sense, with the U.S. Supreme Court referring to what the common man would understand to be a white person. So this is a period when there are large numbers of new immigrants facing a significant barrier to formal citizenship in the United States. Until 1952, the Immigration and Naturalization Act required that immigrants applying for naturalization prove that they were free white persons. So after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution had finally made citizens of the freed slaves, but the Immigration Act still left all other non-whites ineligible. So immigrants from China, Japan, India, and the Near East who applied for citizenship had to determine in federal court whether they were white. So Takao Ozawa had been in the United States for 20 years when he first applied for naturalization to citizenship in 1914. He attended the University of California at Berkeley. He spoke English. He made his children speak English at home. He had a very white complexion. But the U.S. Supreme Court found that Ozawa was, quote, Mongolian rather than Caucasian, based on both racial science as well as common sense. Then, just 3 months later, Bhagat Singh Thind's case came before the court, and it posed a challenge after the Ozawa case because racial science suggested that Thind, who came from the Punjab, was Caucasian. Accordingly, the Supreme Court switched gears and found Thind to be non-white based on what they called the common man test. The test, said the Supreme Court, must be a more open and obvious one than that of science. It is to be found not by the researchers of scholarship, but by the practical application of the good sense and common understanding of ordinary men. By that test, Bhagat Singh Thind must not be white. In all of these cases, racial science and common sense both operated to shift attention away from the visible signs of race to the invisible ones. Racial science promised expertise in reading invisible signs, while common sense assured communities that they already held the racial knowledge necessary to these determinations. So there's a section of the paper where I talk about Indians and invisible blood, but I'm going to skip that because I want I want to make sure to finish in time and just say something in concluding about what I think is the new invisible race in courtrooms today. Despite the considerable scientific consensus today that race is a sociocultural category that does not correspond to meaningful genetic variation, there is nevertheless a burgeoning belief that race can be discerned from genetic material at a crime scene or submitted to a DNA testing company to establish one's racial identity. And this is especially common and problematic for people seeking to establish their Indian identity for various legal purposes with regard to enrollment in Indian tribes. In forensic DNA typing, the police seek to predict and then visually identify criminal suspects based on either physical traits or geographic ancestry, using inferences drawn from genetic material collected at a crime scene. Similarly, testing companies take what they call AIMs, or ancestry informative markers, and argue that they can match an individual's DNA to percentages of ancestry from each pre-contact continent, meaning from the continents before 10,000 years ago, before the time of contact or mobility among regions. They then use those percentages to draw an inference about the person's racial identity. Many scholars have criticized the use of AIMs to pinpoint even geographic ancestry, and I don't have time here to go over those critiques, but I'll simply say that when we make the leap from geographic ancestry to race, there is a deep continuity with performative, invisible race. So, for example, Henry Louis Gates has in the US a television series that uses DNA testing to uncover the hidden ancestry of various celebrities. And the surprise factor in the TV show comes from the fact of replacing visible race with invisible race, one form of common sense overturning the ocular sense. AIMs are analyzed according to frequencies in, quote, selected populations of recent European, African, and Native American descent. In other words, the markers themselves are chosen based on current populations of people of European, African, Native American descent. This is especially problematic for Africa, which has the greatest genetic variation of any geographic area. So inevitably, researchers are duplicating the social category of race in their estimation of frequencies. Even more problematic is when AIMs are used to create ancestry estimates for law enforcement and then translated into racial categories. So, for example, in Louisiana in 2005, the company DNA Witness, using genetic material from a crime scene, estimated that the perpetrator was 85% sub-Saharan African and 15% Native American, and they translated that to mean he was probably a lighter-skinned black man. This caused the police to abandon the search for a white man in a white pickup truck and focus their attention on a black man who was eventually convicted of the crimes. So while the outcome in that case may or have been to find the perpetrator of the crime, nevertheless, I think there is a great danger in using race in this way. By relying on these folk or common sense social concepts of race, they have imported into forensic science all of the historic practices of making invisible race visible. The performance of invisible race suggests some of the commonalities between racial systems as disparate as that of the United States and of Asian untouchable races who are phenotypically indistinguishable from the rest of society, as the group that the previous speaker has just talked about, Professor Kim. Even within the black-white paradigm, racial science has developed side by side with other equally insidious narratives about difference and subordination. While this need not mean that racism is necessarily a universal feature of human societies, it does suggest that we can learn a great deal by widening our comparative perspective beyond the Atlantic world to other, less familiar cultures. It also suggests that binary versus multiple race systems, like that of Latin America, may be less different than sometimes supposed. The imaginary of race will always invent its own visibility out of the invisible. Thank you.